their social organization, their values seem so attractive, so true. You want to dress like them. You want to act like them. You want to have your facial hair like them. You want to have your hair like them. You want to be like them because they're powerful, because they're advanced. And now you look at your holy book, you look at the things attributed to your prophet, and you sometimes think that they look silly. You sometimes think that they sound ridiculous, or that they teach things that are backwards, that don't go along with the nomos, the custom of this new world, a custom which must be true because it's the custom of those people who control everything now. And that's the big crisis, right? So when you hear certain hadiths or you read certain verses of the Quran, you think that you can't accept this anymore because it goes against the values of those societies. We have to remember two things. One, where do you get truth from? This is something I really think Muslims should ask themselves. Where do you get truth from? What is true for you, ultimately? Really, what is the truth for you? Is the truth God? Is the truth the message that God sent to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? Or is the truth the ways of the society in which you live? Is nomos really, like Pindar says, is custom really the king of all? Is custom really your king? This is something Muslims, I ask myself this, I think we should all ask ourselves this question. What ultimately is a source of truth for you? What ultimately is a source of morals for you? Remember the example of the Viking funeral and the Muslim ambassador. He was repulsed by what they did in their funeral customs. They were repulsed by Muslim funeral customs. Repulsion, revulsion, feelings that things are deeply wrong doesn't mean anything morally. It doesn't mean anything in terms of truth. The fact of the matter is that feeling that you have doesn't mean that what the Prophet Muhammad did was wrong. It doesn't mean anything because other people in the world don't have that feeling at all. Other people in this society don't have that feeling. So we have to be very careful not to interpret this, even the deepest, most guttural revulsion as somehow being the truest reaction or the truest evaluation of something's moral character or moral nature. This is very important. And I ask you again, where do you get truth? It's a very important principle. And it's not me giving some fire and brimstone lecture or saying that you have to do something because you're Muslim. Because you might have this reaction, and another person in another country who's not Muslim may find what this hadith says to be completely normal. So why is your reaction about this hadith being ridiculous and unacceptable? Why is your reaction any better than this other person's? And just to give you an example, as I said before, where do you get truth? If you believe that truth is in revelation, and you are at least willing to consider that the hadiths that Muslim scholars have sorted through and analyzed at length to decide if they're reliable, if you at least were willing to give them that benefit of the doubt, why not follow the rule that Muslim scholars followed? If you hear a hadith, think of it, what is most pious, what is closest to guidance, what is most fitting of the Prophet. You may find wisdom. And this is something that, I think it's a very interesting case. You've all heard this hadith, it's in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, of خُلِقَتَ الْمَرْأَةُ مِنْ ضِلْعٍ لَا تَسْتَقِيمُ عَلَى طَرِيقٍ لَا تَسْتَقِيمُ لَكَ عَلَى طَرِيقٍ. Okay? Women, and then there's different versions of the hadith after that, and I'll give you one version. Women are created from a rib, like a bent rib. Rib is crooked. And they will never straighten out for you. Speaking to a man, leka, they will never straighten out for you. If you enjoy them, if you want to enjoy them as they are crooked. If you break it, if you try to straighten them out, you break them. Now, when I first read this hadith, I thought, this is just very sexist. This is obviously made up, Arabs are sexist, and, Muslims are sexist, and everyone in the past is sexist, and so this came out of Arab Muslim people in the past who were sexist, and they made this up because they wanted a way to oppress women. That's what I thought. And I thought, this is really, I don't want to have to go and defend this hadith, and other people are going to come and tell me how can Muslims believe this? And I'm willing to bet I'm not the only person who had this reaction. I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only person in this room who had that reaction. And then one day I was watching just some comedian on Comedy Central or something, or HBO special, and the comedian, as this is the want of comedians pretty much everywhere and all the time, got into his little men understand things this way and women understand things that way. And I thought, it's funny how this seems to be part of every comedy routine, is that the comedian will say, men, they think about money like this. Women, they think about money like that. And of course, anytime a bunch of guys get together, I guarantee you they will sit and talk about the nature of marriage and how women are and how they deal with women. And I don't know, because I'm not a woman and I've never been able to sneak into any of these gatherings, but I assume that this may be the case as well with women. They sit around and talk about why are men like this, why are men like that. And there is a whole industry of books, very successful books, not only commercially, but also I think useful for people's lives, that tell men how to be better husbands by not always thinking like men, but instead seeing the world as women do. So men, and I'm not revealing any trade secrets here as a man, but men generally consider women to be irrational. They consider their brains to be not straight. And sometimes they do really stupid things, and they want really stupid things. This is, by the way, I have no trouble going to court and saying that I believe the majority of men think this. What is this hadith saying? It's saying women, men, from your perspective, men, women are crooked. You can sit around and try and straighten them out. You can sit and tell them, why aren't you more like me? Why don't you see the world the way I do? Or you can accept that that's the way they are, that they're different from men, and accommodate them and try and enjoy life with them in that way. Which is, as far as I can tell from these men are from Mars, Women Are from Venus books, as far as I can tell from reading these books, that's exactly what those books are always telling you, which is don't sit around and try and change your spouse or expect her to act like a man, and women don't expect your husband to act like a woman. Instead, you have to understand how these two genders generally view the world differently, and seeing that difference, accommodate it, and this enables you to live a happier, more peaceful, and more productive life. So suddenly I realized, here I had been judging this hadith all the time, and in fact, it had been making a point not only that comedians make tons of money off constantly, practically their bread and butter, but also that the most respected relationship self-help books also teach you. Now, I'm not trying to say that this is a mu'jiza and we should believe in Islam because the Prophet predicted what Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus was going to say some 1,400 years later. That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm simply arguing is, look how, in my own life, I look at how my reaction changed to this hadith. At first, I completely rejected it. And then later on, I saw that my rejection was simply based on an inflexible reading of the hadith, based on my own prejudices as a modern Western man who comes from a background of not being Muslim. Or maybe the background of a modern Western Muslim who's so overwhelmed, so intoxicated by the dominance of this nomos, of this culture, that I read everything in the past according to it, and that I allow its prejudices to rule me. So I'll leave you with the question, where do you get truth? And if you get it, if you claim to get it from Revelation, why are we, why are you, why am I not more willing to follow that rule of Muslim scholars in the past and interpret that revelation in the way that is most pious, closest to guidance, and most befitting of the Prophet?
When you look at the questions that these young men and women ask, they inevitably center around a core group of issues, all of which are modern, all of which are emanating from within a particular cultural paradigm. In other words, the questions that people of our generation are asking never even occurred to the last generation, or the generation before them, or the generation before them, all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ and before. These are questions that modern society is positing. Questions about the existence of God, sexuality and orientation, gender roles. These things did not exist. Society, by and large, accepted these things as truths. And 100 years from now, the questions that then those generations of Muslims will be asking will be completely unknown of, unthought of by the generations of our times. So, instead of being so quick to question Islam, take a step back and be just as questioning of your own questions and where they're emanating from. Instead of just jumping at the Quran and saying, why does the Quran say this? Take a step back before you get there and ask yourself, why am I asking this particular question and not another one that perhaps 500 or 1,000 years ago was at the forefront of people's minds? And when you start contextualizing yourself, look, you and I, both of us, we are products of a particular civilization, of a particular code of conduct, ethics, morality, of a particular paradigm. We are living and born and raised in a particular context. And the questions that are being spoon-fed to us by the context that we live in, we also should be brave enough to challenge those questions. Why are we not brave enough to challenge those questions, even as we're brave enough to challenge the Quran? Those questions will change. The Quran will remain, as we know, unchanged. But for us to feel this complex, and then we have young people coming up to us, how could Islam allow X? Why does the Quran say Y? Take a step back and ask yourself, why am I asking this question? Where is this question emanating from? Perhaps my own understanding should be questioned before questioning the Quran and Sunnah. Also realize that, as I said, Islam caters to more than just intellectual questions. Far more profound, Islam caters to our inner core spirituality. And in Arabic, that's called the fitrah, the innate subconsciousness that Allah created us upon. We have inside of us some innate subconsciousness, something that Allah put inside every human being. It's called the fitrah. As our Prophet ﷺ said, every child is born upon the fitrah. Every child has this fitrah. What is the fitrah? The fitrah is a source of intuitive knowledge. It's not knowledge that is gained by society, taught to you, spoon-fed to you. You are born knowing certain facts. For example, right from wrong, morality from immorality. Every child knows, every young man and woman knows that to be good is good and to be bad is bad. When you lie, when you cheat, when you steal, that's not good. They know it because it's in the fitrah. When you're kind to the poor, it's something ingrained in us, you feel good about it. And the fitrah also tells us that there is a God and that God is one and He is worthy of being worshipped. So the Muslim does not need to intellectually analyze each and every law in the Quran and Sunnah because his inner conscience is at ease that Islam is true. That inner conscience, the fitrah, will tell him this is a correct religion. And once the fitrah gives him this knowledge, then there should be an acceptance of the minutiae of the more tertiary laws. Now, again, I want to be very clear. I am not saying that Islam doesn't tell us to think. I am saying we don't base the validity on Islam based on the age of Aisha, based on why does a man allow this, why does a woman have to cover, why is inheritance this. These are laws, and you might not understand them. Now, by the way, there are ways to answer every question. Every single question that somebody asks, you could attempt an answer, but some of them are not going to be satisfying. And rather going down this infinite maze and loop and answering every question, take a step back and challenge your own understanding. Challenge your own paradigm before you challenge the Quran and the Sunnah. And the last point that I want to say, and my time is up here, is that if you meet such a person who is having some doubts and whatnot, always tell this person, look, there's one thing that we don't lose, me and you, both of us, and that is to sincerely call out to the one who created you, to guide you, and I will do the same. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. That the power of dua, never underestimated. That if you are in doubt, tell this brother, this sister, if you're really in doubt, then continue to make sincere prayer, because you're not going to lose anything. If you think there's no God, what do you lose by sincerely praying? And if there is a God, then clearly this God will hear you. And we have a very clear belief in our religion, and that is, whoever wants to be guided will be guided. Allah does not play games. Allah does not put traps for the one who sincerely wants the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And if you are not sincere, then every single answer that I give you, you will find loopholes, because for every why, there's a why not. And for every if, there's a but. And for every and, because there's an and there's an infinite loop over and over again. And there comes a point in time where you simply have to say, you know what? I know this man, the Prophet ﷺ, to be a prophet. His lifestyle, his message, his teachings. I know the Quran. I hear the Quran, and I know it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I speak this as a hafidh of the Quran, as a believer in the Quran. Wallahi, I hear the Quran, and I know this is a book from Allah. Just the way it moves me, the way the resonance, the sound, the words, and this book cannot be from a human being. That's all I need to know. I might not be able to answer every single minutiae, but when I know the Quran is the book of Allah and the Prophet is the Prophet of Allah, then alhamdulillah, I submit after that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide me and you and all of us to that which He loves and is pleased with. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
The other day, a young man came to me in the MSA, and he asked me a very difficult question. Like many people of our generation, he was struggling to make sense of what's happening in the world today, of why the Muslim world was always in the news, typically in a negative manner. And it wasn't just about the terrorism and the violence. It was also about, why is the Muslim world so repressive? Why is the Muslim world lagging behind the rest of the world in so many ways? And he brought up the issue of Nobel Prize winners and how many Muslims versus that, scientists, doctors, engineers in the Muslim world. He brought out repressive regimes, etc., etc. And he said that this type of dichotomy, this type of disparity between the Muslim world and the Western world was actually affecting his iman. He was wondering, he was questioning his faith. And he was wondering, if our religion is true, then why are our civilizations so backward? Why are those civilizations that have rejected Islam, they seem to be flourishing on the outside? And of course, yes, just like yesterday's talk that I gave as well, I have to bring in a little bit. And of course, the issue of violence and terrorism. Why is the Muslim world always in the media, always, this violence and whatnot happening? And this began to affect his belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his belief in the truthfulness of Islam, his belief in the Quran as a holy book. And he was coming to me expressing these doubts. Sadly, those sentiments are not unique or rare. And that is why I feel compelled today on this very public stage to begin my talk with that question and to answer, or at least attempt to answer. I only have 15 minutes to attempt to begin an answer, even though the topic is very taboo. Alhamdulillah, we're supposed to honor our righteous and good people. That's great. But do realize, for every righteous and good brother we honor, 10 are thinking of leaving the faith. Do realize that MSAs are, alhamdulillah, flourishing, but for every person who comes for Jumu'ah, at least 3 or 4 are simply not caring about Islam. For every person that comes, at least 5 or 6 are even doubting the faith. A phenomenon of skepticism, agnosticism is now creeping in to our religion, and especially amongst our generation, the MSA generation. And even though it is a taboo topic, still, we need to be brave enough to take on this challenge. And what I want to do in the next 12 minutes or so really is just to start a conversation, to try to begin to answer this question, to maybe inshaAllah ta'ala cause our brain cells to start to think and to analyze things differently, and hopefully to motivate you all to probe deeper and to scratch beyond the surface and headlines. So today's talk is a message to that young brother, and through him to all of my younger brothers and sisters who are struggling with the same problem. Why is the Muslim world lagging behind? Why is the Muslim world a world generally of repression, of violence, of low GDP, of not as many Nobel Prize winners in science and engineering and whatnot? Well, again, much can be said. I want to summarize the answer in 3 simple tangents. Three simple specters that I want every one of you to do more research on. I will begin the conversation, a few minutes on each, but afterwards, each one of you needs to go and read and study and do your own research. The first is history. The second is politics. And the third is theology. Three things we're going to look at very quickly. First, history. In order to understand why we are where we are today, you need to understand what happened yesterday. You cannot isolate today and today's events from yesterday. We are now witnessing certain events, certain realities, and a great place to start is 100 years ago, 1915. 1915 is not that long ago, by the way. My own grandfather, and I'm not making this up, my own grandfather was a teenager in 1915. That's not that long ago, 100 years ago. 1915, if we go back, the world was a very, very different place. It was in 1915, we still had a caliphate. It wasn't the greatest, it wasn't the best, but it represented a continuous legacy of an Islamic heritage and civilization that went back for 1350 years. We still had one. But it was in this year, 1915, that the British and the Allied forces launched their first major attack against the Ottoman Empire, against the Caliphate, aiming straight for Istanbul, the seat of the Caliphate. This attack would eventually lead to the collapse of the political structure that began with the Prophet ﷺ and stretched unbroken all the way up to Abdul Hamid II. Already, the British had begun their tactic of divide and conquer. They had seeped in concepts of nationalism which were unknown to the Ummah before this point in time. They had told the Arabs, how could you live under the Turks? These are not your brethren, even if they're from your same faith. And they had promised the Arabs that if you fight against the Turks, you will be given an independent Arab caliphate, stretching from Iraq all the way to North Africa, including Jerusalem and Palestine. They will be yours. This is what they promised the Arabs. And so, lured by these promises, one group of Muslims openly revolted and fought against the caliphate. They joined the British under the false promises that they would eventually be given charge, and they fought against the caliphate. But even as the British had promised the Arabs freedom and independence, even as they had promised them that you will be given the caliphate, they had already agreed with France and Russia on how to carve up the Muslim world, on how to carve up the Middle East, on who would get what land and who would control what dominion. The modern nation states of Jordan, of Syria, of Lebanon, of Iraq, of Arabia, basically the entire map of the Middle East was quite literally drawn out between a Frenchman and a Britishman, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So the British were lying all along. They knew exactly that the Arabs would not have a unified caliphate. And that is exactly what happened. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Ummah was carved up into all of these nation states. And along with these two promises, on the one hand, there was a promise with the French and the Russians, and this was a secret promise, secret negotiation. On the other hand was the public promise with the Arabs. They made a third promise, also secret, and this was known as the Balfour Declaration. In the Balfour Declaration, they made another secret negotiations with the World Zionist Federation, and they promised them the creation of an independent Jewish homeland in the heartland of Palestine if they supported the British financially in World War I. So three promises every Muslim should be aware of. The public promise to the Arabs, the private negotiation with the French and the Russians, and then the private negotiation with the World Zionist Federation. And so as World War I drew to an end, less than 100 years ago from where we are standing now, Allied forces entered firstly Damascus, and then Jerusalem, and then Baghdad, and eventually Istanbul itself. They entered many more cities, but I mentioned these four because these four are the most painful, because each and every one of them represents the bastion of a previous caliphate, and Jerusalem represents the holiest land to all three faiths. The caliphate of the Umayyads was Damascus, and British soldiers marched into Damascus. Jerusalem, we all know what it is. Baghdad was the caliphate of the Abbasids, and of course Istanbul was the caliphate, was the seat of the capital of the Ottomans. Each and every one of these cities, symbolically, the entire caliphate and its entire history is quite literally captured in the span of 2 or 3 years. And of course, we're only going back 100 years. If I were to go back 200 years, we could talk about the British in India and the destruction of the Mughal Empire and the British Raj. I could talk about the French in Algeria since 1830. I could talk about the Italians in Libya, but let's not go that far. But still, somebody amongst you does need to do the research. The point here is that the modern map of the Middle East was not something that organically came out of the will of the peoples of that region. The very notion of nation states, the very concept of nationalism, the very carving up of the ummah, the borders and the countries that now are the source of so much conflict. The borders and the countries that are now the source of so much conflict, these are all the legacies of foreign involvement in that region. In fact, the entire Palestinian-Israeli conflict is nothing other than one foreign entity, England, deciding to give someone else's land, the Arab and Muslim land, over to a third party, and that is European Jewry. And a quick note here, by the way, Muslims, be careful. Don't conflate Judaism with Zionism. I made that mistake more than a decade and a half ago, and I still regret it. It was a mistake. Our problem is not with Judaism as a religion. Our problem is with Zionism as a racist political philosophy. Jews and Muslims got along fine for most of their existence. Jews and Muslims got along fine before the creation of Israel. In fact, the greatest minds of Judaism, the famous rabbis of Judaism, Saadia Gaon, Moses Maimonides, all of these minds lived and wrote and flourished in Arab lands. Multiple times in our history, when Christians persecuted the Jews, they found safe refuge in Muslim lands. So, brothers and sisters, there is no place for anti-Semitism in our religion, but we have to be honest and frank. Criticism of Israel and a discussion of the history of the creation of Israel has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. My point here today is that as you look at the conflicts of the region, you cannot ignore the series of dominoes that have occurred yesterday. So the first tangent, study history, and especially study two aspects of history. Number one, colonialism and colonialist studies. Go read books on that. Find out what happened. And number two, World War I and its impact on the Middle East. And if you understand these two, you will begin to understand why some of the conflicts, some of the problems exist in our Muslim lands. The second tangent is politics. The world is full of a very few big players who set the rules, and many, many smaller players who try to navigate through and survive those rules. Politics is a dirty game, and sadly, it is not the rich and elite who suffer. It is the masses who suffer as a result of those dirty games. Politics is not a level playing field, and in most cases, it is Muslim lands. It is Muslim lands that suffer the most, especially in lands that are now experiencing violence and Islamic radicalism. And again, this is not to justify, this is not to exonerate radicalism. We all admit that ISIS are not representative of our faith. We disagree with their interpretation of Islam. We have nothing to do with them. And we're not blaming others for their crimes. It is their fault. But we're contextualizing. We're trying to understand, where does this violence come from? It doesn't come from the Quran. It doesn't stem from our tradition. There are other factors we need to take into account as well. And there was a New York Times article just a few months ago about the Arab Spring and how our own country got involved in the Arab Spring behind the scenes and used its influence to dictate how certain people were removed from office and others engineered in through a coup. It's not a coincidence that the situation in the Middle East is as it is. It's not representing the will of the people. It's not a coincidence, as I said yesterday, that ISIS is coming from Iraq and Syria. It's not a coincidence that radicalism typically comes from places that have repressive regimes. So no doubt, we're not exonerating those people, but we need to contextualize. And before you blame Muslims, and only Muslims, take a step back and study history and study politics. And politics and history will tell you a lot more about our current situation than Islam and the religion of Islam. But this does lead me to my final point, theology. How do we understand from a theological perspective why those who believe in Allah and the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ seem to be suffering so much? Why are our lands so backward and repressed? Maybe there are historical reasons, maybe there are political reasons, but then still, if we are believers in Allah and His Messenger, if we're believers in the book, how do we understand theologically a loving and merciful God testing His people in this manner? And this is of course a very deep philosophical concept, and it deals with the issue of the existence of evil and how does one understand the existence of evil. And again, that's beyond the scope of just simply a 5-minute talk. But to summarize in a nutshell, we believe as Muslims that the good that comes out of evil and of suffering outweighs the bad, and that any evil and suffering that happens to a righteous person shall be rewarded much more than the evil and pain itself. In other words, the righteous person who suffers any problem, any pain, any grief will get so much reward in the next life that that pain will become completely absolved and numb. In fact, our Prophet ﷺ said that when the one who is patient sees the rewards of his patience on the Day of Judgment, he shall wish that he had been afflicted with even more calamities in this world. So we believe that evil is returned with good, and we believe that more good comes out of evil. And again, simple philosophical questions. How can we be generous to the poor? How can we sponsor orphans? How can we feed the hungry? Unless there are poor, and unless there are hungry, and unless there are orphans. So one of the purposes of existence of suffering, one of the purposes of evil, is to cause the good in us to come out to combat that evil. The existence of evil causes all of us to try to be good to combat that evil. And the ultimate sign of truth, my dear brothers and sisters, and with this I conclude, is not how many PhDs we have. It's not how many Nobel Prize winners exist in Muslim lands. It's not how large the nation's GDP is. The fact of the matter is that these are not the ultimate criterion of success. And I'm not criticizing those mechanisms. The best of people, the prophets and the Sahaba after them, they didn't have those PhDs or Nobel Prizes. But what did they have? Spirituality, ethics, a purpose of life. And alhamdulillah, that is what we have to give to this ummah. We know our purpose of existence. We know why we are here. We are the ones who have the most morality. We are the ones who are the most generous. We are the ones who respect our elders. We are the ones who have decency and dignity. And it is those values that are far more precious than the material blessings of this world. So to conclude, my dear brothers and sisters, what we have to offer the world is not our money. It's not our PhDs. It is the fact that we are a people who have been made a witness unto mankind. We are tasked with conveying the truth, preaching morality, embodying justice, demonstrating what it is to be a Muslim, epitomizing nobility, and most importantly, representing the prophetic message. Dear brothers and sisters, it's a confusing time we live in. Much is going on. But I ask you, nay, I challenge you to be proud of your heritage, to be proud of who you are, to appreciate your spiritual lineage, and to realize that the gift that you have been given, which is the gift of faith, is a gift that you are meant to share with the rest of the world. And it is the gift of Islam that is the most precious gift and the most prized possession imaginable. And the gift of Islam is the ultimate measure of success. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.